We begin in North America in 1750. It has been 150 years since Western Europeans, most often fleeing poverty, famine, and religious or political persecution, first arrived on the continent. Their migration cost the lives of millions of Native Americans who had lived there for thousands of years, mostly in tribes. On the East Coast, Great Britain has established colonies home to 1.5 million people. The northern regions primarily depend on fishing and trade, while the southern climate is ideal for growing tobacco, rice, and cotton. Wealthy landowners, known as planters, seize vast territories and exploit them by purchasing slaves brought from Africa through the so-called triangular trade. Further west, the Appalachian Mountains form a natural border. Beyond them lies a vast French colony sustained mostly by the fur trade. Tensions escalate between the French and British colonies as the 7 Years' War breaks out in Europe. Emerging dominant, Britain takes control of New France. Native American tribes living there unite, demanding the British leave and recognize their own state. To calm the situation, the British government hastily creates Indian reservations between the Appalachians, the Mississippi River, and the Great Lakes. This displeases the colonists, who want to seize the opportunity to expand their territories westward. Additionally, the war has been highly costly for Britain. Expecting its colonies to help pay off some of the debt through the levying of new taxes, the local population grows increasingly resentful. In Boston, protesting tea duties, colonists disguise themselves as Native Americans, board British East India Company ships, and dump their cargo of tea into the ocean. In this tense atmosphere, representatives of 12 colonies gather in Philadelphia, organizing the First Continental Congress. They decide to boycott British goods. The following year, the War of Independence begins, pitting the rebels, also known as Patriots, against the British and their loyalists. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress proclaims the independence of the United States of America. France sees an opportunity to avenge its defeat in the 7 Years' War. Having heavily invested in its navy, it now has the means to confront the Royal Navy and allies with the Patriots. Spain and the United Provinces of the Netherlands also enter the war against Great Britain. In 1783, the Patriots achieve victory, forcing Britain to recognize their country's independence. The United States gains territory up to the Mississippi River, while Spain takes control of Florida. This marks the first time a European colony gains independence. The United States adopts a constitution based on a strict separation of powers. Legislative power represented by Congress, which passes laws and budgets, judicial power headed by the Supreme Court, which upholds the Constitution, and executive power led by the President of the US as the head of government. On the other hand, each of the 13 states retains sovereignty, has its own constitution, and elects a governor. A decision is made to build a new capital along the Potomac River. To the west, any territory with a free population exceeding 60,000 has the right to form a new state, equal to all others. Pioneers head west, pushing Native American tribes further from the Mississippi. In 1803, France acquires Louisiana from Spain in exchange for the Kingdom of Etruria, but finds defending the vast, remote territory difficult. Fearing its loss in a war with the UK, France sells the region to the US. Congress then funds exploratory expeditions to reach the Pacific Ocean. In Europe, France and the UK clash once again. The US tries to remain neutral but enters the war after disputes with Britain. An attempt to invade Canada fails, while Britain launches a naval raid, reaching Washington and burning the city. Afterward, the US abandons its northern ambitions and focuses south, where the Spanish Empire is in decline. A military incursion into Florida leads to its annexation after negotiations. Out west, the Oregon Territory is divided with the UK. East of the Mississippi, 5 Native American tribes adapt to settled agricultural life. Nevertheless, Congress decides to seize these lands, forcing the indigenous people into reservations west of the Mississippi. Thousands die of exhaustion on the journey. In Mexico, Texas, mostly populated by US immigrants, declares independence. After a war, the Republic of Texas emerges and is annexed by the US in 1845. Because the border is not clearly defined, the two countries end up at war. The US wins, annexing New Mexico and California, where the discovery of gold sparks the gold rush, attracting hundreds of thousands of prospectors from all over the country. To avoid dangerous overland routes, private funds finance a railway across the Isthmus of Panama. California enters the Union as a free state without slavery. The southern states are primarily agrarian and rely on slavery, while the northern states are industrial and free. Both sides want to spread their systems to the western states, driving them further apart. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, who opposes slavery, is elected president. In response, southern states secede one by one, forming the Confederate States of America. The Civil War begins, pitting the Northern Union against the Southern Confederacy. The North establishes a naval blockade of the Atlantic coast, cutting the South off from European support and blocking cotton exports. In 1865, the North wins and uses the opportunity to establish its policies universally. Slavery is abolished, freeing 3.5 million slaves, but African Americans soon become victims of segregation and racism, particularly with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist organization. Fearing Britain might seize Alaska, the Russian Empire sells the territory to the US. To accelerate the conquest of the West, the government funds transcontinental railroads. New machinery boosts agricultural development in the country's center. However, the vast wheat and corn fields come at the expense of the last 150,000 Native Americans, who are confined to reservations. The fertile land makes rapid industrial development possible, and old continental Europe now views the U.S. as a new El Dorado. Fleeing poverty and persecution, many Southern and Eastern Europeans immigrate to the U.S. for low-wage labor. An economic boom primarily benefits a small elite industrial owners who monopolize steel, railroads, oil, and banking at the expense of workers, including women and children laboring in harsh conditions. Protests and strikes for better conditions are often violently suppressed by private military organizations or the National Guard. Seeking international power like European nations, the U.S. annexes Hawaii and turns its attention to Cuba, where an anti-Spanish uprising is underway. The U.S. supports the Cuban independence fighters. After an unexplained explosion of a U.S. Navy ship in Havana, the Spanish-American War begins. The U.S. wins, securing Cuba's independence and taking Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, thus becoming a colonial power. In Colombia, a French company begins building a canal to connect the two oceans. The U.S. buys the project, intervenes to support Panama's independence, and in return, the Panamanian government offers thus a narrow strip of land to complete the canal, which opens in 1914. World War I breaks out in Europe. As workers and peasants are drafted to the front, production drops. Despite its military neutrality, US industry capitalizes on this, selling munitions, food, clothing, and cars on credit to the Entente. Germany responds by attempting a naval blockade, sinking merchant ships in British waters. In 1917, a German telegram proposing a military alliance with Mexico against the U.S. is intercepted, forcing America to enter the war on the side of the Entente. 2 million soldiers are sent to Europe, and 116,000 die. Following the Entente's victory, Europe is heavily indebted to the U.S. The U.S. economy flourishes. Assembly line improvements drastically increase production and lower prices. Higher purchasing power and easy credit led to a boom in car sales, household appliances, and bank stocks. Hollywood becomes a massive global industry, and radio popularizes jazz, primarily in New York. Nightclubs open, stimulating alcohol sales. A conservative government seeking to curb this trend votes for prohibition, making alcohol illegal. In response, thousands of illegal speakeasies emerge, and the mafia seizes the market, quickly growing rich. The South, however, misses out on this prosperity. Falling agricultural prices plunge the region into poverty. The Ku Klux Klan resurges, this time targeting Catholics, Jews, and immigrants alongside African Americans. Membership reaches 5 million before the organization is banned again following several lynchings. In 1929, the Wall Street stock market crashes. The U.S. economy collapses in a few short years, with bankruptcies leaving a quarter of the active population unemployed. Prohibition is repealed, and steps are taken to revive the economy and improve labor conditions. In Europe, World War I begins. Officially neutral, the U.S. prepares for war by reinstating the draft and selling arms mostly to the UK and the USSR. To limit the expansion of the Japanese Empire, which has allied with Nazi Germany, the U.S. imposes an embargo on steel and oil. Japan responds with a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, forcing the US into the war. The U.S. secretly begins researching an atomic bomb. In 1945, the Allies defeat Germany. The USSR and US unite against Japan. A Soviet ground operation in Manchuria and U.S. atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Japan to surrender. At the end of the war, The US supports the creation of the UN to maintain global peace. With Europe exhausted and ruined, the US and USSR emerge as the two primary global superpowers. After World War II, the US and USSR try to expand their influence in Europe. The US implements the Marshall Plan, while the Soviet Union backs pro-communist governments in Eastern Europe. The old world is divided by the Iron Curtain. The two nations enter the Cold War in arms race without direct conflict. The US, having avoided warfare on its own soil, holds an industrial, economic, and military advantage. Domestically, federal employees sympathetic to communist ideas are forced to resign, and Hollywood churns out anti-communist propaganda. Globally, the country resorts to interventionist policies to stop the spread of communism at any cost, intervening in Greece and China, and sending troops to Korea and Vietnam. The Soviet Union strives to catch up after developing its own nuclear weapons. It becomes the first country to launch an artificial satellite and sends the first human into space. The US counters with the Apollo program, aiming to send an astronaut to the moon. In Cuba, a US attempt to overthrow the new communist government fails. The USSR uses this to ally with Cuba, placing nuclear missiles there aimed at the US. Tensions reach a point where World War II seems inevitable, but the two powers compromise, and the USSR removes the missiles. Domestically, growing civil rights movements force the government to revise its social policies. African Americans launch nonviolent campaigns against segregation, women demand equal pay, and Native Americans fight for better conditions. Meanwhile, pacifist students and hippies protest the Vietnam War. In 1969, the US lands the first man on the moon, broadcast live globally. On the world stage, the US tries to ease tensions, beginning a diplomatic rapprochement with China and signing arms limitation agreements with the USSR. In the Middle East, a support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War leads OPEC to impose an embargo against them. After negotiations, the US withdraws troops from Vietnam. Communists win there 2 years later, damaging the US's reputation. The USSR uses this opportunity to strengthen its international policy by invading Afghanistan. The US responds by providing military support to the Mujahideen. In Central America, the US intervenes in Nicaragua and Guatemala to counter communist revolutions. Following its revolution, Iran becomes an Islamic republic opposing US policies, prompting the US to increase its military presence in the Middle East to secure oil supplies. In 1991, the USSR, whose economy is in decline despite reforms, collapses, marking the end of the Cold War. The US becomes the sole global superpower. Domestically, its population demands greater investment in fighting poverty, gang crime, and drugs. However, the US still heavily focuses on foreign policy, showing a clear desire to act as a global police force. When Iraq invades Kuwait and seizes 9% of known global oil reserves, the United States forms a coalition and neutralizes the Iraqi army. Following this, the US creates a list of rogue states that threaten global peace and stability, making them targets of blockades and embargoes. Meanwhile, the military presence of its ally Israel in the Middle East angers radical Islamists, including the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, a former US ally in the Afghan War. US institutions and assets worldwide become targets for terrorist attacks. On September 11, 2001, the United States falls victim to a large-scale terrorist attack on its own territory. Terrorism becomes the country's primary enemy, but this war proves more difficult, as terrorist organizations operate covertly in borderless networks. Having launched a war against the Taliban in Afghanistan, the US toughens its policy toward North Korea, Iraq, and Iran, considering them part of an axis of evil. A new war begins against Iraq, but after rapidly overthrowing the government, US troops find themselves at war with multiple terrorist groups in the region. In 2007, the subprime mortgage crisis and the ensuing global financial crisis strike the world economy. The country attempts to revive its economy by measures such as drastically increasing domestic shale oil extraction. Today, US interventionist policy meets increasingly fierce resistance from developing countries like Russia and China. Nevertheless, the United States remains the largest economic and military power in the world. Thank you all for watching this video, and I remind you that you can support the Russian language GeoHistory channel by subscribing to our Patreon page, where early video publications and voting for the next video's topic will likely be available. See you in the next videos. All the best.